on guys, you're back with my video log and we're on the voiceover again today because everyone seems to like that better than watching me sit in front of a camera and talk, and I greatly appreciate that. And today I'm going to be answering a question from Daniel Tam, and his question was surrounding injuries. So he injured himself performing deadlifts and currently is working with a physio and backlifting moderately now. So his question was how to stay injury free and pre-workout mobility and activation, allowing time off during injuries, and is it possible to train through injuries? So thanks for the question, man. I'm going to be sending you a JPS Sloppy Joe this week, and thanks to everyone who commented. There was some great questions posted, so I really appreciate that. And today we're going to be talking about the key factors in staying injury free in the gym. And it's important to remember that if you're injured, you're on the sidelines, you're not playing the game, which is to lift. And if you're not playing, you can't progress and make them gains. So knowing how to stay injury free and manage injuries is critical to our progression in both strength as well as our physique. So an important distinction to make is between injuries and niggles. Injuries are much more serious than niggles and will require them to be addressed, and more often than not are pathologies that we can't necessarily work through. And injuries will often need treatment from a professional physiotherapist, my therapist, whatever the case may be, whereas niggles are just those little aches and pains that we get as a result of training hard and years in the trenches. So that's an important distinction to make. So what causes injuries in the gym for bodybuilders? Typically, it's overuse, poor exercise selection for that individual's needs, poor technique, failing to have adequate function surrounding the joints to perform specific movements, lack of warm-ups, and sometimes being a little bit too overzealous with our load selection and the amount of volume that we use. So we're going to talk about how to stay injury-free and the 7 things that are important, in my opinion, to keep the body healthy. So the first one is exercise selection. Exercise selection is really important in preventing injury, and we need to make sure that we choose exercises within our program that we have the orthopedic profile to meet. So that means that we can meet the positional demands of those exercises so that we can perform them safely and effectively. Because we need to remember, every exercise is just a stimulus, and in bodybuilding we want a stimulus that will provide the appropriate adaptations, which are hypertrophy, without unnecessary risk of injury. And you can't force a square peg into a round hole. So if you cannot perform a movement because structurally you're not suited to it, then if you try and force yourself to get into those positions, you're only going to get injured and hurt. So selecting exercises that you can perform is the first step in staying injury free. The second thing we need to consider is function and dysfunction. So function simply means the ability to perform a specific movement. So every joint, for example, the scapula, shoulder, elbow, has a textbook function, and the muscles perform movement about that joint. So for most compounds, especially free weight exercise, ensuring that you have adequate mobility as well as stability to get into position is critical to properly executing that exercise. And if you have poor mobility or you're excessively tight, that will limit your ability to perform the action necessary, and there'll be compensatory movement. So that leads to injuries in itself. And importantly, stability can be just as much a rate limiting factor through a movement as mobility, and often gets neglected. So shoulder stability in the bench press is just as important as mobility. So this is really important to pay attention to, and often working with a good physiotherapist or coach can help identify these issues. The third thing is the warm-up. So you would have noticed at the start of this video, I was performing some band exercises, a bit of my myofascial release, and doing some dynamic warm-up drills. So movement preparation is really important to staying injury-free. The goal of a warm-up should be to increase blood flow, activate the appropriate muscle groups, prepare the central nervous system, and practice the skill of that movement. So this can be very, very important in staying injury-free. If you just go from 0 to 100, chances are you're going to get hurt. So time permitted, I'll always ensure that I warm up properly so that I can tick the aforementioned boxes and be as physically and mentally prepared to train. Because if you aren't warmed up properly, again, chances of injuring yourself will only increase. So the fourth thing is timeless form and technique. So understanding the mechanics of a movement and how to best perform the technique of that movement for you in any given exercise is super important. If you have bad technique, either intentionally or unintentionally, you're going to overload the joint musculature in a way that they are not intended to be trained. And this will lead to tightness, imbalances, overuse, and other injuries. So doing some research or getting a good coach and finding out how to perform the technique of the movements within your program is really important to staying injury-free. The fifth thing that we need to look at and address in injury management is the intensity. So the load or the dose, so the volume that we use, can often be the cause of an injury. So sometimes if you're getting aches and pains or you're feeling, things that you shouldn't be feeling, it may not necessarily be any of the aforementioned issues, but it might just be that you're using weights that are too heavy or you're performing too much volume. And it's important to understand that proximity to failure, so when we almost rep out, that can increase the likelihood of injury as well, because technique breaks down, and obviously when technique breaks down, we know that we're at a greater risk of hurting ourselves. So again, it's important to understand that the loads you select play a very big role in managing injuries, and the intensity that you perform those loads, whether it's load on the bar or proximity to failure, is important. If you're hitting deadlifts to failure consistently, chances are you're going to blow your back. If you're hitting bicep curls to failure, well, I don't think you're going to run into too many injuries there. So there's a time and place for going balls to the wall for sure, but we need to be selective and make sure we do it with the right exercises at the right times. And that brings us to point number 6, which is auto-regulation. So training in a fatigued state can increase the risk of injury, and a very beneficial tool to adjusting loads and volume can be auto-regulating your training. So there's a maximum amount of training volume which we can tolerate in a given session and week. And if we train outside of that, we're going to overreach, which means we're going to be over-fatigued and we'll start to negatively adapt. And this only heightens the likelihood of injury. And in my program, I have the RPE scale as a tool to prescribe the loads that I use for each exercise, and I use this to auto-regulate and adjust the weights and volumes that I use based on how I'm feeling, to make sure that I'm not pushing things too much when I'm stressed, when I'm fatigued, when I'm tired. But when I'm feeling great, I'm looking to put the foot down and make the most of that session. And number 7 is maximizing recovery factors. So sleep, nutrition, doing your self-myofascial release, active recovery, stretching, foam rolling, massage, and stress management are some really important factors in staying injury-free. The better recovered we are, the better we can tolerate exercise. And improving work capacity by maximizing these strategies can play a big role in staying injury-free. So if you do have an injury, devise a program that achieves that stimulus that you're looking for without forcing your body to perform exercises that make the injury worse or increase the risk of hurting yourself further. And again, you can modify the exercise by decreasing the range of motion, pay attention to your technique, adjust your training dose, look at your program, and the application of overload isn't too aggressive, ensure you're recovering, and look at the outside recovery factors. But most importantly, guys, if you are injured, make sure you see a physiotherapist or practitioner who has experience working with lifters, and make sure that you are diligent with your training and do whatever you can to work around the injury. It doesn't mean you have to stop training if you get a sore lower back or you get sore shoulders. You just need to find the exercises you can do them, and work on rehabilitating the injured area. So guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure you like it, subscribe to the channel, and I'll speak to you all next time.